Hi students, in this video we're going to continue our discussion of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause by looking at a paper by Sunstein titled Homosexuality in the Constitution. Now in this paper, what Sunstein does is he takes a look at laws against interracial marriage that were overturned in the past, and he looks sort of at why they were overturned, in particular how the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to conclude that those laws were in violation of the Constitution, and what we can sort of take away from that Supreme Court ruling, how it should lead us to think about laws against same-sex marriage. Now, as you know, the Supreme Court has ruled that prohibitions on same-sex marriage violate the Constitution, or at least many of you will be aware of that. So we're not really, in a way, we're not really looking at what's the Supreme Court going to say about the laws against same-sex marriage. Rather, we're going to be focusing on what's problematic about laws against same-sex marriage. So anyway, let's dig in. Sunstein begins his paper by giving us an example from history, a case Loving versus Virginia that was decided in 1967. Now, the two people pictured here were the people at the center of this case. On the left is Mildred Jeter, and on the right is Richard Loving. So here are the facts of the case. So Richard Loving married Mildred Jeter in Washington, D.C., which was a violation of Virginia's prohibition on interracial marriage. The Lovings claimed that Virginia's law against interracial marriage violated the Equal Protection Clause, but Virginia argued that it did not, since it treated black people and white people equally. The Supreme Court sided with the Lovings, arguing that Virginia's law was unconstitutional in virtue of being designated to maintain white supremacy. Here's the Supreme Court's argument. Premise 1. The motive behind Virginia's law was to maintain or promote the superiority of one group, namely white people, over others. Premise 2. If the motive behind a law is to maintain or promote the superiority of one group over others, then that law violates the Equal Protection Clause. Conclusion. Therefore, Virginia's law violates the Equal Protection Clause. All right. So what we see, if we were to symbolize this argument, we get a premise like A, the motive behind Virginia's law was to do this thing. Premise 2 says, if the motive of some law is to do that thing, then what? Then the law violates the Equal Protection Clause. Therefore, Virginia's law violates the Equal Protection Clause. All right, so the argument's valid, and we might just sort of wonder, well, are these premises true? Premise 2 seems pretty plausible. If the motive behind a law is to maintain or promote the superiority of one group over another, then that does seem like people aren't getting equal protection. So premise 2 seems pretty plausible. Premise 1 is the more controversial one, right? What was the motive behind Virginia's law? Sunstein and the court are saying that the point of that law is to maintain or promote the superiority of one group, namely white people, over others. What's our evidence for this, right? Why think that that's right? The answer is that the reason Virginia objected to interracial marriage was because it would sort of confound racial boundaries, right? There was this sense of here's the natural order of things. There are white people and there are black people, and never the two shall mix. That was sort of Virginia's view. And there are some ways in which, right, that might serve to benefit white people, right? If we can sort of separate out us from this other group, we can criticize or look down on, subjugate this other group of people. So that seems like what the law was trying to do, but once we allow interracial marriage, things get more, we see that, things aren't so black and white, right? Race isn't an on or off switch. So clearly we all think, right, that Virginia's laws against interracial marriage were a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, that they were unfair, unjust, that they were wrong, and so they should be invalidated. Now, Cass Sunstein says, consider this hypothetical story, right? No, we don't have any particular people in mind here, but this is a story that we could, that very well may be true, right? So imagine we have two people who seek to marry, kind of like Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving, but in this case, they're two women, right? They're prevented from doing so by a law that forbids same-sex marriage. They argue first that the relevant law violates the right to be free from sex discrimination. This seems like a good strategic choice on their part. Right? The reason is that it's well established that laws that discriminate on the basis of sex will be subject to careful judicial scrutiny and will generally be invalidated. They might try to establish this argument by saying what seems clearly true, that if one of them were a man, then there would be no barrier to the marriage. So there's a discrimination on the basis of sex. Sunstein continues, this argument appears straightforward, but under the current constitutional law, the argument gets nowhere. The prohibition on same-sex marriage, it is said, discriminates on the basis of sexual orientation rather than on the basis of sex. So there's something intuitive about this, right? So when we think about laws against same-sex marriage, we don't think we're discriminating against people based on sex. We think that the discrimination is based on sexual orientation, and that's the sort of explanation. So while the Constitution, there's sort of well-established, cases, law that we can't discriminate based on the basis of sex, we don't have laws that prohibit people from discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And so the thought is if we're originalists or whatnot, there's nothing in the Constitution that's going to suggest that we can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. So that argument, the argument that the couple in this hypothetical scenario are giving isn't going to work. So what Sunstein argues at this point is that if the courts didn't accept Virginia's prohibition on interracial marriage, then they shouldn't accept the current prohibitions on same-sex marriage. So what he's saying is there's a parallel here between the laws against interracial marriage and laws against same-sex marriage. This is because, according to Sunstein, just as miscegenation laws were motivated by a desire to maintain or promote white supremacy, prohibition on same-sex marriage are motivated by a desire to maintain or promote male supremacy. So that might strike you as implausible, right? You might think, come on, you can't be serious. Laws against same-sex marriage aren't about male supremacy. But Sunstein's going to give us some pretty good arguments, some pretty good reasons to think that they are. Now, Sunstein's argument is going to start in a way with that same premise that we had before, right? So premise 2, if the motive behind a law is to maintain or promote the superiority of one group over others, then that law violates the Equal Protection Clause. We said before that premise sounds pretty good. If a law is there to maintain or promote the superiority of one group, then yeah, that's wrong. It's not giving people equal protection. But if we take that same premise that we accepted before and we continue to accept it, Sunstein's going to add another premise to it to get us the conclusion he wants. Right? So premise 1 says the motive behind prohibitions on same-sex marriage are to maintain or promote the superiority of one group, namely men, over others. Conclusion, so the prohibitions on same-sex marriage violate the Equal Protection Clause. Now the controversial claim here, right, is going to be premise 1. Right? People are going to say, is that really the purpose of prohibitions on same-sex marriage? Are they really trying to promote the superiority of men over women? That would be kind of strange. It doesn't seem like they're doing that. But what Sunstein says is the sort of reasoning behind premise 1 in the interracial marriage case is going to be, there's going to be a parallel kind of reasoning here. So same-sex marriages, he says, are banned because of what they do to gender categories, because of how they unsettle those categories, right? The thought before was that it's nice, it's simple if our world is in, there are black people and white people, and we keep it simple, there's no gray. But the the same thing's going on here, right? Same-sex marriages are banned. We want to just keep our sexual categories simple, right? They're men and women, and men are attracted to women, and women are attracted to men, and let's like leave it that way. And maybe the sex roles that we have for men and women, let's just keep those the way they are, right? That's what he's going to argue. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this premise. In particular, let's look at an objection. Right? So for Sunstein, he says the motive behind these laws is to maintain or promote the superiority of one group, namely men, over others. But maybe you think the motive is actually different. Maybe it's to maintain or promote gender roles, and not so much superiority of one group over another. Would that be any better? I'm not sure, right? So you might think, no, like preserving gender roles is just as problematic because, it turns out that the roles that men play are more prestigious or something than the ones that women play, so there's still a kind of problem. Women aren't getting equal protection. But let's say, maybe there's something to this. Let's try and think about like how this argument might go. So one way you might say is that we're justified in maintaining or promoting certain gender roles because gender isn't socially constructed. So whereas race is socially constructed, we just sort of create out of nothing these sort of categories. Gender isn't a social construct, right? There's really a biological basis to it. It's a real feature that people have. Men, it turns out, might say, are good at certain things. Women are good at other things. They're not so good at the same things. Now, again, these are, maybe you say these are generalities or something, and when we point in certain directions, we might think that there's something there, like men are faster and stronger in general than women are. But as we all know, right, there's these things exist on a spectrum. So there are some women that are stronger than many men, many women that are faster than many men, but we've got men who are faster than women, so it's complicated. But maybe there is something to this. That's how the objection goes. Another way of sort of putting the objection is that to say like, well, racial categories do lie on a spectrum, but gender categories are binary. Now, there might be something plausible to that initially. Yeah, we can see sort of how we can have mixed race people, but it's less obvious that we could have mixed gender people. But, I think whereas that argument might have worked better in the past, we don't really think that argument's very plausible now. It seems pretty obvious that gender is, it is a non-binary spectrum. So I'm not sure how much this objection is really going to work. Now maybe the objection that you find more, that you're more attracted to is something to say, well, it's not really to maintain or promote the superiority of men over others. It's to maintain or support the superiority of one group, which is heterosexuals, over another group, homosexuals. Sunstein is going to give us some reasons in a second to explain why he doesn't think that's really right. So we'll look at that in a second. Before we do, though, let's take a look at premise 2. So how could we object to this premise? The premise says, if the motive behind a law is to maintain or promote the superiority of one group over another, then the law violates the Equal Protection Clause. The objection that occurs to me, right, is just this question about whether or not the motive behind a law could really be relevant to whether or not that law violates the Equal Protection Clause. If it's true that the motive can determine whether or not the law violates the Equal Protection Clause, then it would seem like if we could come up with some different motive for the law, then it might not violate the Equal Protection Clause. So if we say, well, this isn't really our motive, I know that it's doing that. So let's say we know that laws against same-sex marriage do promote male superiority or male supremacy, then, but that's not what we intended it to do. Would that be enough to justify the law? And I think the answer there is no, right? So maybe there is something kind of wrong with premise 2. Maybe we could get, maybe a better premise would say something like, if a law maintains or promotes the superiority of one group over another, then the law violates the Equal Protection Clause. So maybe like the motive of the law isn't important, maybe just like the consequences or the effects of the law are what's important. But I think either way, the laws against same-sex marriage are going to be in trouble, right? Because it seems like maybe we shouldn't, I don't know, maybe this is my way of arguing that this argument is weak, but we could give a stronger argument, and maybe it's better if we say, if a law maintains or promotes the superiority of one group over another, then the law violates the Equal Protection Clause. If we go with that premise, I think Sunstein's argument works just as well. Okay. So we looked at maybe some objections that aren't really fully going to work. Sunstein has, I think he still, in a way, owes us an explanation of why we should think that laws against same-sex marriage are discriminating on the basis of sex rather than on sexual orientation. So here's the explanation. So for Sunstein, he thinks the evidence suggests that prohibitions on homosexual relations are best seen as an effort to ensure that there are clear lines about sexual and social activity as opposed to sexual and social passivity or receptivity. So, I think here it's just worth reflecting on like what would motivate someone to prohibit same-sex marriage. Maybe the initial inclination is to think something like, well, it's unnatural. But there are all sorts of things that we might think are unnatural that we don't prohibit. As long as they're not harming anyone else, right? We think you can do basically whatever you want, even if it's unnatural. Like, who cares? We don't seem to get all up in arms about that. So, why is it? Like, what's the motivation? I think it's hard. Do you really think like heterosexual people are better than homosexual people? That seems like a strange thing to think. And so I think there's something really plausible about what Sunstein is saying here, which is that there are these sort of two categories: people who are supposed to be sexually and socially active, and this other group of people who are supposed to be sexually and socially passive or receptive. Obviously, the thought is that men are supposed to be sexually and socially active, women are supposed to be sexually and socially passive or receptive. Men are supposed to be political, they're supposed to have jobs, they're the hunters, they're not the gatherers, they're like doing the active thing, they're not passive. So say we think there's something to this explanation, then we think about, well, why is homosexuality stigmatized? And what Sunstein points out is that male homosexuality is going to be stigmatized for one reason, female homosexuality is going to be stigmatized for a slightly different reason. And I think these explanations they strike me as really plausible and illuminating. So his thought is that male homosexuality is stigmatized primarily to discourage male sexual passivity, thereby ensuring that men won't be feminized. So he gives this quote from Mike Tyson saying something like, "I'm going to make you my girlfriend." And the thought is like, that's bad. A man doesn't want to be made into a girlfriend because that would make the man into a passive being, and being passive is bad. And so there is this idea of like, men don't want to be thought of as being passive or receptive. And what homosexuality, or like normalizing male homosexuality, makes us think that like men could be in this passive or receptive role. But men don't want to be in that role, right? Men want to be in the active role. And so we stigmatize male homosexuality so as to protect ourselves, I guess speaking as a man, right? We stigmatize male homosexuality to sort of prevent ourselves from having to think about ourselves as passive or receptive. Okay, that's why we stigmatize male homosexuality. But why do we stigmatize female homosexuality? For Sunstein, the answer here is that we stigmatize female homosexuality primarily to discourage female sexual and social activity, right? We don't, it's not that we're worried about us being passive. Here, it's that we don't want women being active. He talks about cases where, women who are leaders in organizations get sort of described as lesbians because they're taking on this active role. I think the other reason that he talks about, and I think this is really interesting, his thought is that if females are sexually and socially active, then they're potentially going to take themselves off the market for men. So if women become active, then they get to choose who they partner up with. Or if women decide that they're interested in other women, then they're off the market for men. And so what men sort of want is that they want to be in charge of the market, right? They don't want women deciding who they're going to partner up with. Men want to decide who they're going to partner up with. And so if we can think of women as in a passive or receptive role, then the thought is, well, when a man asks a woman to go out with him or whatever, then the woman sort of has to say yes, right? She's at the whims of men rather than being in control of her own sexual and social life. So that would be the reason, according to Sunstein, that female homosexuality is stigmatized. And so if he's right, which I think these are really plausible explanations, if he's right, his argument is that the whole reason that we stigmatize, have stigmatized same-sex marriage is because we want to preserve the sort of the dominant sort of cultural norms where male supremacy, where men are seen as superior, as active, and women are seen as passive, receptive. So here's a quote from Sunstein near the end. He says, "The distinction between the rigid categories male and female, with the accompanying social and sexual traits active and passive, has especially conspicuous harmful effects for gay men and lesbians." Obviously, right, if they're sort of violating the norms, then they're going to be criticized and discriminated against and things like that. But Sunstein says, "For all of us, the categories and traits are much too crude to account for social and sexual life when both of these are going well." So his point is that, you know what, life is more messy and complicated than we make it out to be. Like, in any relationship, a man's going to play the active role in certain cases and the passive role in others. Same with women, right? It's not that men are always active, women are always passive. And so really maybe it's good to break down these categories in a certain kind of way and appreciate that we exist not in these dualistic roles, but that we are on a spectrum, and that sort of the roles that we play can depend on the circumstances and situations that we're in. All right, I want to finish this video with a discussion of a more recent case of Bergefell versus Hodges. Here we have a picture of a Bergefell holding a image of his partner, John Arthur. They were married, I think, very briefly before Arthur's death. He had some sort of disease, ALS maybe, that he died of before the case could be heard. But the reason I want to talk about this case is because it raises the question, the issue that Sunstein had been thinking about, 20 years before in the late 90s. And the central legal question in that case is this: do prohibitions on same-sex marriage violate the Equal Protection Clause? Right? Should we invalidate those laws in the same way, maybe for the same sorts of reasons that we invalidated laws against interracial marriage? And so that's, in some ways, that's the question that I want you to be thinking about. Do prohibitions on same-sex marriage violate the Equal Protection Clause? Maybe this is going to depend on sort of how you read the Constitution, right? This goes back to our debate over, originalism, living constitutionalism, natural law theory, legal positivism, that those might sort of influence your view here on this. But let's say you think, I think this is plausible. Maybe most people will think, yeah, prohibitions on same-sex marriage do violate the Equal Protection Clause. If so, how so? Are you convinced by Cass Sunstein's argument that they discriminate on the basis of sex, or do you think they discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation? Think about not only what you think, right, but why you think it. Again, something important to be coming up with your arguments for your views. Not just having views. I joke, I don't care what you think. You're just an undergraduate student, but I do care about the arguments, right? The arguments are important. The reasons are the things that are going to convince me and other people. So think about that, answer that before you go on. Now, how did the Supreme Court rule? Many of you will know already that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Obergefell. So in a 5-4 opinion authored by Justice Anthony Kennedy, the Supreme Court ruled that prohibitions on same-sex marriage do violate the Equal Protection Clause. And therefore, in doing so, they gave the right to marriage to same-sex couples across the United States. Now, maybe the sort of sad thing about the opinion, you might say, well, now I'm wondering, right? Did they say that they violated the Equal Protection Clause because they discriminated against people based on sex, or did they say that they violated the Equal Protection Clause because they discriminated people on the basis of sexual orientation? And here I've got to give you sort of the sad answer is that Kennedy did not take a stand on this issue. So he didn't really say whether or not those prohibitions discriminated on the basis of sex or on the basis of sexual orientation. So it's unclear what the problem with those laws are. So that's, we don't know. Maybe we'll never know what the Supreme Court thinks about this. Maybe there'll never be a decision. But I suspect maybe we'll have some ruling at some point that forces the justices to decide whether certain laws against same-sex couples or whether certain kinds of laws or policies discriminate on the basis of sex or sexual orientation. All right, that's it for this video. Have a good one.